One of the most important ideas that Jesus gave the world concerns your value. Let's talk about that today on the Daily Download. Last week we visited a little bit about kind of the birth of democracy and how it comes out of the Jesus teachings. And Jesus gave the world this kernel of an idea that across the course of history has demonstrated it in a new way of everyone looking at individuals. And from that, as we talked about last week, grew the idea of democracy, the idea that every individual has the right to some kind of self-government, some say in the way that they are governed, and really at the core of that, some idea about the fact that they have a conscience, that they have responsibility unto God to follow. This is what our founding fathers thought, and it's certainly what we believe across most of the Western world today. Now, beneath all of that is this idea of the worth of the individual. Like an individual person is important. And this was a foreign notion until Jesus comes along. For the most part, people thought about tribes, they thought about groups, they thought about families, they thought about nations, governments, and powers. But the individual having intrinsic worth, this is an idea that clearly comes out of Scripture. That's 2024. And still today, there are currents in our culture that would push against the idea that every person is important. It sounds like something everybody would agree with, but if you really think about the nature of scientism, Darwinian evolution, that would say survival of the fittest. Like the unfit don't need to live. Those who are not healthy and productive to society are not worth keeping around. Maybe you remember the old movie Logan's Run. It's this very notion that when people got older, they needed to sort of be done away with because they were a drain on culture, they were a drain on society, and so we were better off without them. And that sounds horrific to us. In our ears, it rings untrue. But there's been times in history where people were much more utilitarian about human life. The Roman people were rather famous for the fact that sometimes they would abandon their girls out in the field or out in the woods because they didn't want to carry them. They didn't want to take care of a baby girl because she wasn't as valuable to the family. Again, abhorrent to our ears. Why do we feel this way about life? Darwinian evolution wouldn't say this is true. Many cultures would say that every individual life isn't necessarily valuable, that they can be thrown away or disregarded. We were in China one time on a mission project, and I was stunned to hear that there were farmers who would literally sell their daughters into prostitution into the city because they wanted to have the money that would come from that decision. What father would make that choice? Well, some fathers in some places would, because they don't necessarily share this worldview that would seem to you to be normal and natural and obviously the way things ought to be. And it is this idea that every individual human is of great value. Again, where did that come from? It came from Jesus. The Jesus who said that God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that who'd ever believe in him would not have to perish, but would have everlasting life. The Jesus who welcomed the little children to come and speak with him, even though children were seen as second or third class citizens in those days. The Jesus that would speak to Mary Magdalene about his resurrection before anybody else in a time where women were seen as second class. Jesus over and over and over again demonstrates that every human being is valuable to God, even if the culture says they're not worth as much or they're not worth anything at all. In 2024, we believe every human life is valuable. Children are valuable. The unborn child is valuable. Older adults are valuable. Those who are infirmed or those who have handicaps or special challenges, they're really valuable. Their life matters. We all recognize that this is sort of a hallmark, a foundation of Western civilization is the worth and the value of the individual. And why is all of this true? Because every individual is valuable and important to God. And if they're valuable and important to God, then they ought to be important to us. And we ought to live and act as if their life is sacred and special and important because the God of the universe that created them has declared it to be so. And so it is true. Now, today, as you go about your life, maybe you've got questions about why you're valuable. And it's the same reason we've been talking about today. Your life is important because God has declared it true. He's made you uniquely like you are. He sent Jesus down the cross for you because you were so important. He offers you forgiveness and salvation and a place in his family because you, among that 8 billion people on this planet, are important to God. And if you're important to God, you ought to be important to me and the people that live in your neighborhood and your family. And you ought to be important to yourself. Your life is valuable. God has declared it to be so. And what's true about you will be true about every person you lock eyes with today. They're all very valuable because they're very valuable to the God who created them. Now, this is a core belief of the Christian faith. It is distinctive from a lot of other worldviews Thank the Lord that we live in a Western culture that has grabbed a hold of this particular teaching of Jesus and holds it widely, even among those who may not follow after his name. I hope you have a great day today. Treat the people around you like they're valuable because they certainly are. Love you guys. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.